Hello, lovely people. Welcome back to Sleep History with Sikandar. If you're already in bed, already somewhere warm and quiet, already letting the day fall away from you, then you're exactly where you need to be tonight. Settle in. Get comfortable. Let me take you somewhere. Picture this. It's a Tuesday morning. The year is 1957. You're sitting at a kitchen table in a small house on a street of identical houses, somewhere on Long Island, and the house is so quiet you can hear the refrigerator humming from across the room. Not a dramatic sound, not the kind of sound you'd normally notice. But this morning, with the children gone and the front door closed and the whole house empty except for you, that hum is the loudest thing in the world. The children left for school 40 minutes ago. You stood in the doorway and watched them go. Your daughter in her plaid skirt, your son with his lunchbox banging against his leg, and then you closed the door, and the house folded around you like a glove. Your husband's car pulled out the driveway at 7:15, the same time it pulls out every morning, and you stood at the window and watched the tail lights join the tail lights of every other car on the street. A slow procession of identical sedans heading for the highway, heading for the city, heading somewhere that is not here. You watched until the last one turned the corner, and then you turned back to the kitchen. The kitchen is clean. You did the dishes before the children left. You always do the dishes before the children leave, because the sink should be empty before the day begins, because that is how a house is supposed to look in the morning. You wipe down the counter with the cloth you keep folded by the faucet, and you can still smell the faint chemical sweetness of the cleaning spray on the Formica, that particular scent that sits somewhere between lemon and something industrial. The scent of cleanliness as a product. The floor is swept. The laundry is already in the machine, turning slowly in the basement below you, and you can feel the faint vibration of it through the soles of your slippers, a gentle tremor in the linoleum as though the house itself is breathing. The coffee is still warm. The morning light is coming through the window above the sink, falling across the table in a pale rectangle, and there is nothing in that light that needs your attention. Nothing broken, nothing urgent, nothing undone. The house is spotless. You open a small bottle on the table beside your coffee cup. You tip one white pill into your palm. It's smaller than an aspirin, lighter than you'd expect for something that does what it does. You place it on your tongue and wash it down with the last of the coffee, and you sit there for a moment, your hand flat on the cool Formica, and you wait. Not for anything in particular, just for the quiet to deepen, just for the thing that has been sitting behind your ribs since you woke up, that formless, nameless pressure, like a breath you can't quite finish, to ease. And it does. The pill begins to work. And the question you can't quite say out loud, the question that sounds, if you could give it words, something like, is this all there is, doesn't go away exactly. It just goes quiet, not answered, just quiet. Here is the thing most people never stop to consider about the 1950s American housewife. Most people assume her unhappiness was invisible, a private feeling she kept hidden even from herself, something she didn't have language for, something the world around her was simply too busy or too indifferent to notice. But that isn't what happened. Doctors noticed. Pharmaceutical companies noticed. Magazine editors noticed. They documented it. They named it. They studied it. And then, rather than address it, they manufactured a pill to make it manageable, and sold it to her doctor with an advertisement that promised it would make even pregnancy a happier experience. If this kind of storytelling is what helps you wind down tonight, I'd love it if you hit subscribe and left a like. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. And tell me where you're listening from tonight. In bed, on the couch, curled up somewhere with something warm to drink. I love knowing. I always read your comments, and they honestly make my evening. Now dim those lights. Let whatever was pressing on you today settle down. Let the room get quiet around you. Let's go back together, back to that kitchen, back to that street of identical houses, back to the hum of the refrigerator and the pale morning light on the Formica. Let's find out how she got here. To understand the woman sitting at that kitchen table in 1957, you have to understand the morning that surrounded her. Not just her morning, the morning of every woman on her street, on the next street, on every street in the development. Because the thing about Levittown, and the hundreds of communities built like it in the years after the war, is that they were designed so precisely, so uniformly, that the experience of one woman's Tuesday was, with almost no variation, the experience of them all. You're standing at your kitchen window. It's just past 8 in the morning, and the last of the cars has turned the corner at the end of the street. The sound of engines has faded. What replaces it is a particular kind of silence. Not the silence of the countryside, which has birds and wind and distance in it. Not the silence of a city apartment, which has traffic and footsteps and the muffled sound of other people's lives pressing through the walls, but the silence of a place where every door has closed at the same time and everyone who had somewhere to go has already gone. You can hear a dog barking somewhere, a lawnmower starting up, 2 or 3 streets over, its distant buzzing like an insect trapped against glass, the faint clatter of a screen door. But mostly the street is empty. The driveways are empty. The sidewalks, which were built for walking, which were poured in concrete alongside every road and every cul-de-sac, led to nowhere you need to go today, because there is nowhere to go. The nearest shop is 1.5 miles away. The nearest friend who isn't already in her own kitchen, staring at her own clean countertop, is in exactly the same position you are. And the car, the one car your household owns, is currently on the Long Island Expressway heading toward Manhattan, with your husband behind the wheel and his briefcase on the passenger seat. This is the physical reality of your morning, not the magazine version, where a smiling woman in a clean apron stands at a gleaming counter surrounded by chrome appliances and sunshine. The physical reality. Your feet are in slippers on linoleum. Your back is already starting to ache, the low-grade ache that comes from standing at a sink that was built to a standard height that doesn't quite match your own. The air in the kitchen smells of percolator coffee and toast, and the faintly waxy scent of floor polish you applied yesterday and can still feel, just slightly, under the soles of your slippers when you walk across the floor. Outside, through the window above the sink, you can see the backyard, the yard that is exactly the same size and shape as every other yard on the street. The yard with the chain-link fence that separates your grass from your neighbour's identical grass. The yard where your children played yesterday, and where the evidence of that play, a ball, a rope, a stick, is still sitting in the dew. And beyond the fence, if you look past your neighbour's yard and through the gap between the houses, you can see the street, and the street is empty. The whole world, as far as you can see from this kitchen window, is an empty street, and a row of identical houses, and a sky that is blue and clear and completely, utterly indifferent to the fact that you have nowhere to go. Nobody warned you about this, not because they were being cruel, not because they were deliberately withholding information, but because nobody thought of it as a thing at all. The house was a gift. The house was supposed to be the ending of the story, the reward, the thing you worked toward and dreamed about and saved for. You had grown up during the Depression, or your parents had, and the idea of owning your own home, your own kitchen, your own yard, your own washing machine, that was supposed to be the destination, the place where everything was finally, permanently all right. And yet, standing at this window, watching this empty street, listening to this particular silence, you feel something you can't quite name, a restlessness that has no object, a weariness that has nothing to do with physical tiredness. Your hands are clean, your house is clean, your children are healthy and fed and at school, and you have approximately 9 hours before any of them come back through that door. 9 hours. That's a long time to spend with a clean house and a question you can't ask out loud. The houses themselves were remarkable in their way. The efficiency of their construction was something the country had never seen. In 1947, a builder named William Levitt had taken the principles of the Industrial Assembly Line, the same principles that Henry Ford had used to build automobiles, and applied them to home construction. He broke the entire process of building a house down into 27 distinct steps, each performed by a specialized crew. One crew laid foundations, another framed walls, another installed wiring, another hung doors, another painted. They moved from house to house like a tide, each crew arriving after the last, each performing its single task and moving on. At the peak of this operation, Levitt and Sons were constructing 30 new houses per day. 30, not 30 per month, not 30 per quarter, 30 per day. Each house was a Cape Cod, a small, functional, affordable home designed for a family of 4 or 5, and each one cost approximately $8,000, which a returning veteran with a G-bill loan and an FHA-backed mortgage could finance with monthly payments lower than the rent on a city apartment. The deal was extraordinary. The demand was overwhelming. Thousands of families applied, tens of thousands of families applied, and entire communities, streets and cul-de-sacs and neighborhoods of houses so identical that families sometimes walked into the wrong one by mistake, sometimes tried their key in the wrong lock, sometimes sat down in the wrong living room before realizing that the furniture was slightly different. Entire communities appeared on what had been, 12 months earlier, potato fields. The houses came with built-in appliances. They came with identical floor plans. They came with yards. And the yards came with something else. Covenants, legal agreements, written into the deed of sale, that required you to mow the grass every week, to maintain the property in a condition the community approved of, to keep the exterior looking the way it was supposed to look. The lawn was not a personal choice. It was not a matter of taste. It was a contractual obligation, enforced not by any specific authority, but by the quiet, relentless pressure of your neighbors, who were also mowing their lawns, who were also maintaining their property, who were also watching, because in a street where every house looked exactly the same, the state of your lawn was one of the only things that made your family visible. You feel this pressure in your body. You feel it in the specific tension of pulling the curtains back in the morning and checking before you've even had your coffee whether the lawn needs attention. You feel it in the weight of the lawnmower, which is manual, which you push across the grass in the midday heat, because the grass must be cut, and your husband isn't here to cut it, and the neighbour's grass is already cut. You feel it in the particular anxiety of a dandelion, one dandelion, appearing in the front yard, and the knowledge that it is visible from the street. And you feel, underneath all of it, the strange mathematics of this arrangement. Your husband leaves at 7:15. He returns at 6:30. For 11 hours and 15 minutes of every weekday, you are alone in this house. Not imprisoned, nobody has locked the door. Not mistreated, nobody has said anything unkind. Just alone, in a house that faces inward, on a street that leads nowhere you need to go, without access to the one machine, the car, that could take you somewhere else. The car belongs to whoever commutes. The commuter is your husband. The house belongs to you. She's doing what you do. That's the thought that might occur to you, listening to this, wherever you are tonight. She's lying awake, or she's not sleeping, or she's standing at a window, and she's doing the same thing you do when the world gets very quiet, and the question in your chest won't settle. She's trying to figure out whether the restlessness means something is wrong with the world, or something is wrong with her. You try to fill the hours. Of course you do. You're not the kind of person who sits still and does nothing. You never were. You join things. You join the Parent-Teacher Association, and you attend the meetings, and you help organize the bake sale. And the bake sale is fine. The bake sale is pleasant. The bake sale gives you an afternoon of purpose, and then it's over and you're back in the kitchen. You join a bridge club. You play bridge on Thursday afternoons with 3 other women from the development, and you deal the cards and bid and play and keep score. And the conversation is warm and polite and never quite reaches the thing that's underneath. Because none of you are saying it. That's the remarkable part. Each of you is sitting at that card table with the same feeling in her chest, and each of you believes she is the only one. Each of you is performing contentment for the others, the way you were taught to perform it, the way every magazine and advertisement and doctor's waiting room has told you it should look: calm, composed, grateful, busy, happy. And the performance is so convincing, so consistent, so universally maintained, that not one of you thinks to ask, do you feel it too? The afternoons are the hardest, not the mornings. The mornings have structure. Breakfast, dishes, laundry, cleaning. The morning is a machine that runs on routine, and you can lose yourself in it the way you can lose yourself in any repetitive task, the way the body takes over and the mind goes somewhere else. But the afternoons, the long, flat, featureless stretch between lunch and the children's return from school, the afternoons are the hours that belong to nobody. You might sit on the back step with a cup of coffee and watch the yard. The grass is green, the fence is solid. A bird lands on the clothesline and sits there, balanced, considering you with the kind of mild curiosity that makes you wonder, briefly, what you look like from the outside. A woman on a step, a cup in her hands, a yard that is identical to every other yard on the street. What does the bird see? Does the bird see anything at all, or just a shape in a landscape of shapes, still and unremarkable, no more interesting than the fence or the grass or the clothesline? And then the children come home, and for 2 hours the house is full again, full of noise and motion and needs and questions and arguments and spilled things and lost things, and the particular chaotic energy of small human beings who have been at school all day and have brought the world back with them. You make snacks, you supervise homework, you break up a fight, you find a missing shoe, and the restlessness recedes, because you are needed, because there are tasks, because the machine is running again, and then dinner. Your husband's car in the driveway at 6:30, the sound of his key in the lock, the brief habitual exchange, how was your day? Fine, how was yours? Fine. Dinner on the table. The family together, 4 faces around a Formica table, and the children talking about school, and your husband talking about work, and you listening, nodding, pouring milk, cutting meat, clearing plates, and thinking, not resentfully, not angrily, just quietly, privately, in the space between one task and the next, that nobody at this table has asked you what you did today, not because they don't care, because they already know. You did what you always do. You ran the house. You maintained the system. You kept everything clean and fed and orderly. And what else would there be to tell? After dinner, you washed the dishes again. The same dishes, the same sink, the same cloth, rinsed and wrung and hung over the faucet. The children go to bed. Your husband settles in front of the television with the newspaper on his lap, and the house gets quiet again. A different quiet from the morning quiet, a tired quiet, a quiet that has been earned by the hours between. You sit in the living room and you pick up your own magazine, and you turn the pages, and the advertisements smile at you. A woman in a kitchen, a woman with a vacuum cleaner, a woman holding a bottle of cleaning spray and looking genuinely, radiantly happy about it, and you wonder, with a kind of mild, floating detachment, whether the woman in the advertisement feels the way you feel, or whether she knows something you don't. And yet, just 10 years earlier, these same women had been doing something else entirely, something that used their hands and their minds and their full physical strength, something the country had begged them to do. During the war, during those extraordinary, desperate, impossible years between 1941 and 1945, women had entered the American workforce in numbers the country had never imagined, and would not have believed possible a decade before. Before the war, roughly a quarter of all American women worked outside the home, 1 in 4. By 1945, that number had climbed to more than 1 in 3, and these were not the genteel, semi-decorative positions that women had occasionally been permitted to hold. These were not secretarial roles or shop assistant jobs, or the kind of work that could be described, without too much exaggeration, as keeping a woman busy until she found a husband. Women were building aircraft. Women were operating lathes, punching sheet metal, driving forklifts, running assembly lines. Women were welding bomber fuselages in factories so large that you could lose yourself in the sound of them. That tremendous, metallic, rhythmic roar of an entire production floor working at capacity. You can smell it if you close your eyes. Metal shavings, machine oil, the sharp ozone tang of arc welding, the warm, stale smell of a factory floor at the end of a 10-hour shift, when the air itself feels dense with the effort of making things. You might have been one of them. You might have been 22 years old in 1943, standing on the floor of a defense plant in Michigan or California or Connecticut, your hair pinned up under a scarf to keep it from the machinery, your hands in work gloves that were too large for you because they were designed for men's hands, your coveralls smeared with grease and grit. And the noise would have been tremendous. The noise would have been constant. But underneath the noise, you would have felt something that is harder to describe, a sense of purpose that moved through your body like electricity, a sense of being needed, a sense of being good at something that mattered, and you would have been right. The production records from those years are clear. The efficiency reports are clear. The plant managers who had resisted hiring women, who had argued, in memos and meetings, that women couldn't handle the physical demands, couldn't maintain the pace, couldn't be trusted with precision work. Those same managers were writing different memos by 1944. Their female workers were, in many documented cases, more reliable than the men they had replaced, more precise, more consistent, more productive. You know this feeling. Not the specific feeling of a 1943 factory floor, but the general feeling. The feeling of being competent and knowing it. The feeling of finishing a shift and looking at what you've made and knowing that it matters. The feeling of earning your own money, in your own name, and depositing it in your own account and making your own decisions about what to do with it. That feeling was real. It lived in the bodies of millions of American women for 4 years, and then it was taken away. But let me stay with those factory years for another moment, because the physical details matter. They matter because the body remembers what the culture tries to make it forget. You would have woken up at 4:30 in the morning. The alarm clock, the wind-up kind with the bell on top that rattled the nightstand, would have pulled you out of sleep, and you would have dressed in the dark, quickly, efficiently, the way you learned to dress when every minute counted. Not a skirt, not stockings, not the careful, layered, time-consuming outfit that a woman was expected to assemble before she could be seen in public. Coveralls, work boots, a scarf for your hair. You dressed the way a person dresses when they are going to do something, and the doing is more important than the looking. The walk to the bus stop would have been cold. You can feel that cold now, can't you, if you think about it? Early morning cold, the kind that sits in your lungs and makes your breath visible. Other women at the bus stop stamping their feet, clutching lunch pails, their faces still soft with sleep. The bus arriving, warm and bright and full of the particular energy of people who are all going to the same place for the same reason. And then the factory itself. The doors opening and the wall of sound hitting you like weather, the hammering and grinding and roaring of an industrial operation running at full capacity. A sound so enormous that it became a kind of silence after a while, the way a waterfall becomes silent if you stand next to it long enough. The smell of hot metal and industrial lubricant and the faintly sweet, slightly burnt scent of electrical insulation. The floor vibrating under your boots. The foreman pointing you to your station. And then your hands finding the tools, and the tools finding the work, and the work flowing through you like a current, steady, purposeful, precise. You were making something. That's the detail that mattered most. You were making something that someone needed. Every rivet you set held a piece of an aircraft together. Every weld you laid down would eventually carry a human being through the sky. The work was hard and it was loud, and it made your shoulders ache and your hands tremble by the end of the shift, but it was real. It was connected to something larger than yourself. And when you walked out at the end of the day, into the cooling air, with the other women streaming out beside you, there was a feeling in your body that had nothing to do with exhaustion, and everything to do with satisfaction. You had done something today. You had made something today. Tomorrow you would make more, and then the paycheck. Your paycheck. With your name on it. Not your husband's name. Not your father's name. Yours. You could hold it in your hand and feel the weight of it. Not the paper weight, but the meaning weight. The weight of a society saying to you, for the first time in your life, you are worth this. This is what your labor is worth. This number, printed on this check, made out to you. The next time you reach for your own wallet, tonight, tomorrow, whenever, think about what that gesture means. For the women we're talking about tonight, that gesture was new. That gesture was revolutionary. And it lasted 4 years. The war ended, the men came home, and the world, the same world that had printed posters of Rosie the Riveter, that had run national campaigns telling women their patriotic duty was to work, that had featured them in newsreels and newspaper articles and government films, showing them building the machinery of victory, that same world changed its mind. Not gradually, not apologetically, practically overnight. The jobs were taken back. Some women were laid off outright. Others were gently but firmly encouraged to resign. For the duration, the government had said. Your job is for the duration of the war. The duration was over. The factory floors were cleared. The coveralls were returned. The work gloves that were too large for women's hands were put back in the supply closet, and the women who had worn them, the women who had welded and riveted and driven trucks and managed supply lines, those women were directed somewhere else, somewhere quieter, somewhere with a Formica table and a humming refrigerator. You can feel what that transition was like if you close your eyes for a moment. 1 week you're standing on a factory floor with a welding torch in your hand and the roar of production all around you, and a paycheck with your name on it folded in your pocket. You know where you stand. You know what you're worth. You know what your hands can do because you can see the evidence of it in the aircraft fuselage in front of you, in the clean line of the weld, in the rivet head sitting flush against the aluminum skin. The work is hard and the hours are long and your body aches at the end of every shift. But the ache is honest. It means something. It is the ache of someone who has done something that matters. And the next week you are standing in a kitchen. A new kitchen, in a new house, on a new street. And the silence is extraordinary. Not the silence of rest, not the silence of peace, this silence of a world that has suddenly, without explanation, stopped needing you. Your hands are the same hands, your mind is the same mind, your skills are the same skills. But the context has changed, the context has shrunk. The context is now a house, and the house is clean, and the question of what to do with yourself, with this body, with these hands, with this mind that was trained to solve problems and is now solving nothing more complex than whether to serve chicken or meatloaf for dinner, that question settles into your chest like a stone, and it stays there. The transition was not gentle, it was not gradual. For many women, it happened in weeks. You had a job and then you didn't. You had a purpose and then you didn't. You had a paycheck and then you had pin money. You had colleagues and then you had neighbours. You had a factory floor and then you had a kitchen floor. And the world, the entire world, from the government to the newspapers to the magazines to your own family, told you that this was not a loss. This was a gain. This was the reward. This was the life you've been fighting for all along. The cultural machinery that accomplished this shift was, in its way, just as efficient as Levitt's assembly line. The message came from everywhere at once. It came from magazines, which began publishing articles about the deep satisfactions of homemaking, articles written with warmth and conviction, and the absolute certainty that a woman's highest calling was to create a beautiful home for her family. It came from advertisements, which showed radiant women in spotless kitchens, their hair perfect, their smiles wide, holding products that promised to make domestic life not just bearable but fulfilling. It came from doctors and psychologists who wrote papers and gave lectures about the natural feminine instinct for nurturing, the psychological health of the woman who embraced her domestic role, and the implied pathology of the woman who didn't. And it came from the workplace itself. The marriage bar, a formal, institutional policy that either refused to hire married women or required them to resign the moment they married, was still in effect across the country. At the peak of its enforcement, the marriage bar affected more than half of all office positions in the United States, more than 50%. Not because married women couldn't do the work, not because there was any evidence that marriage made women less competent or less reliable, but because there was a consensus, a cultural, institutional, almost gravitational consensus that a married woman belonged at home. That detail is worth sitting with. More than 50% of all office jobs in the country closed to you the moment you signed a marriage certificate. The same certificate that was supposed to be the happiest document you ever signed. And the pressure didn't come only from institutions. It came from everywhere. It came from the texture of daily life, from the air itself. It came from the way people looked at you if you mentioned missing your job. It came from the way your mother-in-law raised her eyebrows when you said you'd been thinking about going back to work. The slight tightening of her mouth that said, without words, that good wife didn't need to work, that wanting to work was a sign of something wrong with your marriage, with your home, with you. It came from the television. In the evenings, the families gathered around the set, the blue-grey light flickering in the living room, the warm hum of the tubes, the faint smell of heated dust from the back of the cabinet, and they watched families that looked like theirs. Father Knows Best. The Adventures of Ozzie and Harriet. Leave It to Beaver. And in every one of these programs, the wife was in the kitchen. The wife was cheerful. The wife had dinner ready, and the house clean, and the children managed, and she did all of it with a warmth and a grace, and a seemingly effortless competence that made the whole arrangement look not just natural, but inevitable. As though any woman who struggled with it, any woman who found it tedious or limiting or suffocating was simply doing it wrong. You watched these programs, and you compared yourself to the women on the screen, and you found yourself wanting. Not because you couldn't do what they did. You did it every day. You did it perfectly. Your house was clean, and your children were fed, and your husband's shirts were ironed. But because you couldn't do it with that smile. You couldn't feel the way they seemed to feel. You couldn't summon the contentment that was supposed to come automatically, like a reflex, like breathing. You did the work, you performed the role, but the feeling, the deep, genuine, radiant satisfaction that every magazine and every television program and every advertisement promised would follow, the feeling never arrived. And so the women who had welded bomber fuselages and managed factory production lines found themselves in Levittown, in a kitchen, at a Formica table, with a clean house and a humming refrigerator, and a lawn that needed mowing, and a morning that stretched ahead of them like a hallway with no doors. The apron was not a symbol of comfort. For many of them, it felt like a demotion, a reassignment from a job they were good at to a job that would never be finished, never be evaluated, never be promoted, and never end. I want you to carry that with you as we go further into this story tonight, not as an abstraction, but as something physical, the specific weight of competence without an outlet, the specific restlessness of a mind that was trained to solve problems and is now solving nothing more complex than what to serve for dinner, the strange, private guilt of being unhappy in a house that is supposed to be the reward for everything your generation suffered, because the house was waiting. It had been designed specifically for these women, and it had been designed with something very specific in mind. Now, let's step inside one. Let me show you what she was working with. The house is new. Everything about it is new. You can smell it the moment you walk through the front door. That particular combination of fresh plywood and drying paint and linoleum adhesive and something faintly chemical that you'll later learn to call the smell of modernity. The smell of things that have never been used. The smell of a life that hasn't started yet. The walls are white, the floors are clean, the windows are clear, and the light that comes through them falls on surfaces that have no memory. Nobody has cooked in this kitchen. Nobody has argued in this living room. Nobody has cried in this bathroom. The house is a blank page, and you are supposed to write on it, with furniture, with curtains, with the particular choices that will make this house yours. The problem is that 17,000 other women on this same development are writing on the same page, with the same furniture, sold by the same stores in the same colours, arranged in the same rooms. You walk through the front door into a small living room. There is a sofa, or there will be. There is a television, the screen of which is the grey-green of an unlit monitor, the kind of surface that reflects your face back to you when you're not watching it. There is a carpet. To your left, a narrow hallway leads to 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. The bedrooms are small. The children will share one, at least until you can afford an addition. The bathroom is standard, tub, toilet, basin, mirror, tile, in a colour someone else chose. And ahead of you, through an archway, is the kitchen. This is where the designers put their real attention. This is where the engineering happened. This is where you will spend the largest portion of your waking life, and the designers knew it, and they planned for it with a precision that was, in its way, remarkable. The kitchen faces the backyard, not the street. The street is the direction the husband's car goes when it leaves in the morning. The street is where the world is. The kitchen faces the other direction, toward the yard, toward the fence, toward the children who will play there while you watch through the window above the sink. The architecture itself tells you where you belong. The front of the house is for arriving and leaving. The back of the house is for staying. There is a refrigerator, white and humming, standing in its designated alcove like a piece of furniture that has opinions. There is a range, an electric range, because this is a modern house, because gas ranges are old-fashioned, because the future runs on electricity and the future is where this kitchen lives. There are the countertop Formica, cool to the touch, in a shade of pale green or yellow or pink, that was chosen by someone who has never met you, but who believed, with total confidence, that this was the colour a woman would want to look at for the rest of her life. And in the basement, accessible by a narrow staircase behind a door in the hallway, there is a washing machine. It churns, it vibrates. You can feel it through the floor when it's running, that faint tremor, as though the house itself is digesting something. These machines were supposed to be your liberation. The advertisement said so in language that was almost breathlessly enthusiastic. The magazine articles said so. The entire post-war appliance industry was built on a single, gleaming promise that technology would free the American housewife from drudgery, would give her the one thing she had never had enough of: time. Time for herself, time for reading, for thinking, for the life of the mind, time to be something other than a pair of hands in a kitchen. And in a narrow mechanical sense they were right. A washing machine does wash clothes faster than a washtub and a mangle. A vacuum cleaner does clean a carpet faster than a broom and a dustpan. A refrigerator does preserve food longer than an icebox. These are facts. The machines work. The technology delivers. But here is the detail that surprises people. Here is the fact that seems, on first hearing, almost impossible. Despite the mass adoption of washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, electric ranges, and every other labour-saving device the post-war consumer economy could produce, despite the gleaming countertops and the humming motors and the advertisements showing women with their feet up reading novels because the machine was doing the work, despite all of it, the total number of hours the average American housewife spent on domestic labour did not significantly decrease. Not in the 1950s, not in the 1960s. The hours stayed roughly the same. A researcher named Joanne Vanek published a study in 1974 that demonstrated this with careful, methodical precision. She compared time use data from the 1920s through the 1960s and found that non-employed housewives in the 1960s, women with washing machines, vacuum cleaners, electric ranges, refrigerators, and every gadget the century had produced were spending almost exactly the same number of hours on housework as non-employed housewives in the 1920s. The machines had changed, the tools had changed, the hours had not. I find that quietly astonishing. 40 years of technological progress, an entire industry built on the promise of liberation, and the liberation never arrived. Why? Because the standards changed. The washing machine didn't mean you could wash the same amount of clothes in less time and then do something else with the hours you'd saved. It meant you were now expected to wash more clothes, more often, to a higher standard of cleanliness. A family that had changed bedsheets once a fortnight before the war now changed them every week. A child who had worn the same shirt for 2 days running now needed a fresh one every morning. Towels that had been used and reused were now considered unacceptable after a single bath. The machine made washing easier, so the culture made washing more frequent. And the total hours, the actual time a woman spent engaged in the labour of maintaining a household, remained exactly where they had always been. Which, as efficiency revolutions go, was not quite what the advertisements had promised. The same pattern repeated across every appliance. The vacuum cleaner didn't mean your carpet could be clean in 10 minutes and then you were free. It meant your carpet was expected to be clean at all times, visibly clean, demonstrably clean, and everyone could see if it wasn't, because everyone else's carpet was clean too, because everyone else had the same vacuum cleaner. The refrigerator didn't mean you could shop less often and store food more efficiently. It meant your meals were expected to be more elaborate, more varied, more freshly prepared, because you had the technology to keep ingredients fresh, and therefore no excuse not to use them. The range didn't mean cooking was faster. It meant cooking was expected to be better. You feel this in your body if you live in one of these houses. You feel it in the specific ache of your lower back from bending over a kitchen counter that was built to a standard height that doesn't quite match yours. You feel it in your hands, which are rough and dry from the cleaning products that promised ease but left a chemical film on your skin that no amount of Jergens hand cream seems to fix. You feel it in the tension across your shoulders from pushing a vacuum cleaner across the same carpet, in the same pattern, every single day. You feel it in the tiredness that comes not from hard labour, not from the kind of exhaustion that makes you sleep deeply, but from the repetition of tasks that will need to be done again tomorrow, exactly the same way, with exactly the same result. The dishes are clean now. They will be dirty again in 6 hours. The floor is swept now. It will need sweeping again by evening. The laundry's done now. There is always more laundry. There is always more laundry. And you feel it most of all in the silence between the tasks. Because the machines are not quiet, the washing machine rumbles, the refrigerator hums, the clock ticks on the kitchen wall, steady and deliberate, counting minutes that all feel the same. But underneath all of that mechanical sound, there is a deeper quiet. The quiet of a house that has nothing to say to you. The quiet of a morning with no purpose beyond maintenance. The quiet of a life that is technically perfect and somehow, in a way you cannot explain to anyone without sounding ungrateful, without sounding spoiled, without sounding like a woman who has everything and deserves nothing more, not enough. You sit down at the Formica table. It's cool under your hands. It's always cool, some quality of the material, some property of the laminate, the way it absorbs the temperature of the room and holds it. Never warm, never cold, just smooth and neutral and steady. You've sat at this table 1,000 times. You've fed your children here. You've balanced the household accounts here, pencil on the back of an envelope, subtracting the cost of groceries from the weekly allowance your husband calls pin money, because that's what it's always been called, and you've never liked that phrase, but you've never said so. You've written letters here. To your mother, to the friend from college you haven't seen in 3 years, the friend who is also sitting at a table in a kitchen somewhere, also wondering. You've drunk coffee here, in the morning light, watching the yard through the window, watching nothing happen. This table is the centre of your world, and your world is this kitchen, and the kitchen faces the backyard, and the backyard has a fence, and beyond the fence is another backyard that looks exactly like yours. The machines were supposed to give you time. What you've discovered, quietly, privately, in the gap between the last clean dish and the first dirty one, is that time without purpose is not a gift. It's a weight. And the weight is settling on you now, somewhere between your ribs, somewhere behind your eyes, and you're not sure what to call it, and you're not sure who to tell, and you're starting to wonder whether there's something wrong with you, because every magazine you read, and every advertisement you see, and every neighbour you talk to seems to be saying the same thing, which is that this house, this kitchen, this life, is everything a woman could possibly want. Let me walk you through one of those days. Not a bad day, not a crisis day, just an ordinary Tuesday. The kind of day that repeats itself so faithfully that by the 3rd week, the 4th week, the 15th week, you can close your eyes and predict every hour before it arrives. You wake at 6:15. Not because an alarm wakes you, your body wakes you the way it always does, trained by repetition to open your eyes at the precise moment when the first tasks of the day need to begin. Your husband is still asleep beside you, and you ease yourself out of bed quietly, carefully, the way you've learned to do without disturbing him, because his alarm doesn't go off until 6:30, and those 15 minutes are the only ones in the day that belong entirely to you, the kitchen. You start the percolator. The smell of coffee is the first real thing in your day, rich and dark and immediate, the one sensory pleasure that hasn't been swallowed by routine. While the coffee brews, you start breakfast. Toast for the children, eggs for your husband too, over easy, the way he likes them, the way he has always liked them, the way he will like them tomorrow and the day after that and the day after that. You set the table. 4 places, 4 forks, 4 knives, 4 napkins, folded the same way every morning, placed to the left of each plate. The children come down. There is noise. Finally, there is noise. The scraping of chairs, the clink of glasses, your daughter asking about her spelling test, your son spilling milk and not caring. Your husband appears, dressed, his tie knotted, his briefcase already by the door. He eats standing up, which he does most mornings now, one hand on his coffee cup, the other reaching for the car keys. He kisses you on the forehead, a warm, distracted, habitual kiss, the kind of kiss that means goodbye and not much else. And then the children leave, and then the house is quiet again. You wash the breakfast dishes, 4 plates, 4 forks, 4 knives, 4 glasses. You dry them and put them away in the cupboard, in the same spots they always go, the spots your hands know by memory, the spots your eyes could find in the dark. The counter is clean, the table is clear, the floor needs sweeping. There are crumbs, there are always crumbs, and you sweep them into a dustpan and empty the dustpan into the trash, and the floor is clean. It's 8:15. You make the beds, your children's beds first, pulling the sheets tight, tucking the corners, smoothing the blankets, arranging the pillows the way they should look, which is the way nobody's children ever actually leave them. Then your own bed, the master bed, and this takes longer because the bedspread is heavier and the standard is higher, because this is the room a guest might see, even though no guest has been in this room in months. It's 8:45. You gather the laundry, you sort it, whites, darks, colours, delicates. You carry the first load down to the basement, and the stairs are narrow and the basket is heavy, and the basement smells of damp concrete and detergent. That particular underwater smell of a room designed for machines and not for people. You load the washing machine, you measure the soap, you turn the dial, the machine begins to churn, and you climb the stairs back to the kitchen. It's 9 o'clock. You vacuum the living room carpet. The vacuum cleaner is heavy, heavier than it needs to be, and you push it in careful rows back and forth, the way the carpet shows the lines, the way you can see, when you're finished, that the room has been attended to. The pattern of vacuum lines on a carpet is the visible evidence of a task completed, and you find yourself, some mornings, standing in the doorway of the living room just looking at those lines, straight and parallel and orderly, because they are the only proof that the last hour of your life produced something you can see. It's 9:30. The rest of the morning unfolds in the same way it always does. You dust the furniture, you wipe the bathroom, you check the laundry, you transfer wet clothes to the line in the backyard, or to the dryer if you have one, hanging each piece with the careful, practiced motion of a woman who has done this 1,000 times, and will do it 1,000 more. You plan dinner, you make a shopping list, you sit down at the Formica table with a cup of coffee, and the morning stretches ahead of you, and you wonder, in a way that is neither dramatic nor self-pitying, what it would feel like to want to be somewhere. A sociologist named Anne Oakley studied this experience with a researcher's precision. In 1974, she published a book called The Sociology of Housework, and in it she compared domestic labour to factory assembly line work, not as a metaphor but as a direct analytical comparison. She measured the monotony, she measured the fragmentation, she measured the isolation, and she found that housework ranked higher than factory work on measures of all three. Higher. The women in the kitchens were more bored, more fragmented, and more alone than the workers on the factory floor. The factory workers at least went home at the end of the shift, and you're not the only one who's noticed. But we'll come to that in a moment, because first I want to tell you about a woman who did something extraordinary with that feeling, and what happened when she tried to tell people about it. In the spring of 1957, a woman named Betty Friedan went back to her college reunion. She had graduated from Smith College 15 years earlier, in 1942, one of the most prestigious women's colleges in the country, a place that had educated some of the sharpest minds of a generation, and the reunion committee had asked her to put together a questionnaire for her former classmates, something to fill a booklet, something to see how everyone was doing. Betty agreed, and she sat down and wrote a survey that asked questions nobody else was asking. She asked about decision-making in the home, who made the choices, who held the money, who decided where the family went and what the children studied. She asked about housework, how many hours, which tasks, how it felt. She asked about motherhood, the joys, yes, but also the frustrations, the exhaustions, the things you weren't supposed to say out loud. She asked about interest outside the home, careers they'd dreamed of, books they'd read, ambitions they still carried somewhere in the back of their minds, quiet as a pilot light. She mailed the questionnaire to roughly 200 women, educated women, women who had graduated summa cum laude, who had written theses on literature and political science and economics, women who had debated philosophy and studied foreign languages, and been told by their professors that they could do anything, be anything, go anywhere. And now, 15 years later, Betty Friedan wanted to know, what had they become? The answers came back, and they were not what anyone expected. By every visible measure, these women were fine. They had husbands, good husbands, responsible husbands, husbands who commuted to respectable jobs and came home for dinner. They had children, healthy children, fed and clothed and enrolled in schools. They had houses, many of them in exactly the kind of suburb we've been walking through tonight. They had appliances and lawns and station wagons and subscription deliveries and bridge clubs and parent-teacher associations. They had, by the standards of their generation, everything. But underneath the fine, underneath the everything is wonderful, there was something else. A note that appeared in answer after answer, phrased differently each time but unmistakable once you started looking for it. A dissatisfaction so persistent, so consistent, so quietly devastating that Betty Friedan could barely believe how many of her classmates were saying the same thing. They were unhappy, not dramatically unhappy, not unhappy in a way that involved shouting or leaving or breaking down in public places, not unhappy in a way that anyone else could see, unhappy in a way that was much harder to describe, a persistent feeling of emptiness, a sense that the days were passing and nothing was accumulating except clean dishes and folded laundry. A question, the same question, over and over, in different words, in different handwriting from different kitchens in different suburbs in different states. Is this all? And the part that struck Friedan hardest, the part that made her sit at her own table for a long time, staring at the stack of returned questionnaires, was that every woman who wrote about this feeling believed she was the only one. Every single one of them. They felt it alone. They described it alone. They apologized for it alone, as though the feeling itself were a personal failure, a deficiency, proof that something was wrong with them specifically, not with the kitchens that had been designed around them, not with the world that had placed them there, not with the system that had built the houses and sold the appliances and run the advertisements and manufactured the magazines that told them every month how happy they were supposed to be. One woman wrote that she felt as though she were living someone else's life. Not unhappily exactly, not miserably, just as though the life she was living belonged to a person she had agreed to become but had never quite arrived at. She made the meals, she ironed the shirts, she attended the school plays and the doctor's appointments and the neighborhood barbecues. She did everything that was expected, and she did it well, and at the end of every day she felt not exhaustion but a strange, persistent emptiness, as though the day had happened to her rather than been lived by her. Another woman, a former chemistry student, a woman who had spent 3 years in a laboratory before the war ended and the world decided she should be in a kitchen instead, wrote that she sometimes stood at the sink and imagined the chemical reactions happening inside the dishwashing soap, the surfactant molecules binding to the grease molecules, the emulsification, the surface tension breaking. She thought about it in detail, in the precise methodical way she had been trained to think, because the thinking itself was a relief, a moment of using her mind the way it had been built to be used, even if the only context available was a sink full of dirty dishes. A third woman wrote simply, "I feel like I'm waiting for something, and I don't know what it is, and I'm afraid that when it arrives it will be too late." Friedan read these answers at her kitchen table. She read them carefully, one by one, in the handwriting of women she had known 15 years ago. Women who had been sharp and ambitious and full of plans. Women who had debated politics and written papers on economic theory, and stayed up late arguing about Dostoevsky. And now those same women were writing to her about dishwashing soap and school plays, and the particular shade of loneliness that arrives at 2 o'clock on a Tuesday afternoon, in a house where everything is clean and nothing needs doing. Friedan took these answers, and she tried to write about them. She drafted an article. She had the data. She had the quotes. She had the weight of 200 women's handwritten admissions that the life they were living, the life the whole country insisted was the ideal, was not what they wanted. And she pitched the article to the major women's magazines of the day, McCall's, Ladies' Home Journal, Redbook, the publications that millions of American women read every single month. Every one of them turned her down. Not because they thought she was wrong. Not because they challenged her data or her methodology or her conclusions. They turned her down because they believed their readers didn't want to hear it. One editor reportedly told Friedan that the American housewife didn't want to be told she was unhappy. She wanted to be told she was doing a wonderful job. Another said the article would upset the advertisers, and the advertisers, the companies selling washing machines and vacuum cleaners, and floor polish and Formica countertops, were the people who paid for the magazine to exist. The article was not rejected because it was false. It was rejected because it was inconvenient. Because the truth Friedan had documented, that millions of educated, intelligent American women were quietly miserable in the lives the culture had designed for them, was bad for business. The housewife was a consumer. She bought things. She watched advertisements, and she bought the things in the advertisements. And she did this because the advertisements told her that buying things would make the life she was already supposed to be happy with even happier. To tell her she was unhappy was to risk disrupting the entire mechanism. The whole machine depended on her contentment, or at least on her silence. We'll come back to what happened to that article, and to Betty Friedan, and to the book she eventually wrote, the book that broke open everything. But first, I need to tell you about what arrived instead. Because while Friedan was being told her findings were too uncomfortable to publish, someone else had already found a different kind of solution. Not an answer, not a conversation, not a change, a pill, and it had the most remarkable origin story in the history of modern medicine. In 1945, in a laboratory in England, a Czech-born bacteriologist named Frank Berger was working on a problem that had nothing to do with unhappiness, nothing to do with housewives, nothing to do with the quiet desperation of empty suburban mornings. He was trying to find a preservative for penicillin. That's all. The new wonder drug, the drug that was saving lives on battlefields and in hospitals across the world, was being broken down by certain bacteria before it could reach patients, and Berger's job was to find a chemical compound that could stop that from happening. It was a technical problem, a chemistry problem, a problem involving test tubes and petri dishes, and the kind of patient, methodical laboratory work that never makes the front page of anything. In the course of his experiments, Berger synthesized a substance called mefenizine, and when he tested it on laboratory animals, standard procedure, routine safety testing, the kind of work that fills thousands of pages in thousands of laboratories every day, something unexpected happened. The animals became calm, not sedated, not unconscious, not knocked out the way barbiturates knock them out, collapsed and drooling on the floor of their cages. Calm. They lay still, their muscles loose, their breathing slow and steady, their eyes open and clear. They were awake. They were aware. They could track movement, respond to stimuli, process what was happening around them. But the agitation was gone. The restlessness was gone. Some quality of anxiety that had been present in the animal's baseline behavior, the twitching, the pacing, the low-grade alertness that is the default state of a caged laboratory animal, had simply evaporated. They looked, Berger noted in his report, as though someone had explained to them that everything was going to be all right, and they had believed it. He wrote up his findings, and in that report he used a word that would change the course of pharmaceutical history. He called the effect tranquilization. The word itself, tranquilization, from the Latin tranquillus, meaning calm, meaning quiet, Meaning still entered the medical vocabulary because a Czech bacteriologist in an English laboratory noticed that his test animals had stopped being afraid. Mefenicin itself didn't last long enough in the human body to be useful as a drug. It wore off too quickly. It required doses too large to be practical. But Berger didn't let go of what he'd seen. He held on to the image of those animals, awake, alert, calm, their eyes open and untroubled, and he carried that image with him when he emigrated to the United States in 1947, when he took a position at Wallace Laboratories, a small pharmaceutical company in New Jersey, when he became director of research and began a systematic search for a compound that could do what mefenicin had done, but better, longer lasting, more potent, safe enough to give to a human being who was not in a cage but in a kitchen. He found a partner, a chemist named Bernard Ludwig, and together over months of careful, methodical work they tested hundreds of variations. Hundreds. Each one slightly different from the last, each one a new molecular arrangement, a new combination of atoms, a new attempt to create the compound that Berger had been carrying in his head since 1945. Picture the laboratory. Not the gleaming cinematic version of a laboratory, not the one with dramatic lighting and a single vial glowing on a table. The real one. A room with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors and metal shelving units lined with bottles. The smell of chemical solvents, sharp and slightly sweet. The kind of smell that sits in the back of your throat. The sound of ventilation fans running constantly, pulling air through filters, keeping the room at a temperature that is comfortable for chemicals, but slightly too cold for human beings. Berger and Ludwig worked side by side at a bench, their hands moving with the practiced, unconscious precision of people who have performed the same motions thousands of times, measuring, mixing, heating, cooling, testing, recording, starting again. Each variation was a new sentence in a language they were still learning to speak. Each one said something slightly different to the nervous system. Too short-acting, too sedating, too many side effects, not potent enough, too potent. The wrong kind of calm, a sluggish, heavy calm, the calm of a body being suppressed rather than soothed. They were looking for something specific, something that Berger could feel but not yet articulate, a calm that preserved consciousness, that left the mind clear, that took the anxiety away without taking anything else with it, a calm that felt, to the person experiencing it, not like the absence of feeling, but like the presence of peace. And they found it. The compound was meprobamate. It worked beautifully. It produced, in test after test, in animal after animal, the same extraordinary calm that mefenicin had produced, but it lasted longer, it required smaller doses, and its side effects appeared at first to be minimal. The first human trials were cautious, as first human trials always are. Physicians administered meprobamate to small groups of patients, people with anxiety disorders, people with insomnia, people who had come to their doctors with the same vague, difficult-to-describe symptoms that would later fill waiting rooms across the country. And the reports came back. The drug worked in humans the way it had worked in animals. Patients reported feeling calmer, not numb, not disconnected, not drowsy in the way that barbiturates made them drowsy, unable to think, unable to function, wrapped in a pharmacological fog that made the world distant and muffled. They felt calm. They felt present. They felt in many cases more like themselves, or more like the selves they remembered being, before the anxiety had colonized their nervous systems and taken up permanent residence. One detail from the early trial stays with me. A physician reported that a patient who had been unable to sleep for weeks, a woman, as it happened, though the report didn't emphasize this, took me probirmace for the first time and slept through the night. When she woke in the morning, she told the doctor that she hadn't felt so rested in months. Not because the drug had knocked her out, because it had quieted the noise, the specific, relentless, internal noise of a mind that would not stop turning over its own anxieties long enough for her body to remember how to sleep on its own. The drug hadn't given her rest. It had removed the obstacle to rest, and the distinction, though subtle, mattered enormously. Berger heard these reports, and he believed he had created something important, something that could help millions of people. He was not a cynical man. He was not a pharmaceutical executive calculating market share. He was a scientist who had seen suffering and had found, through patient and meticulous work, a compound that could alleviate it. The irony of what came next, the industrialization of his discovery, the marketing machine that would turn a laboratory finding into a cultural phenomenon, the transformation of a treatment for genuine anxiety into a tool for managing the ordinary discomforts of modern life. That irony was not something Berger anticipated. He had made a drug. Other people would make it a product. There was just one problem. The executives at Wallace Laboratories didn't think anyone would buy it. Who, they asked, would take a pill for anxiety? Anxiety wasn't a disease. Anxiety wasn't something you went to the doctor for. Anxiety was a mood, a temperament, a personal failing at worst, and a minor inconvenience at best. You couldn't sell a pill for a mood. There was no market. Berger had an answer. He went to the laboratory and he filmed his tranquilized rhesus monkeys. He made a short film, a crude, homemade film, the kind of thing you'd show at a company meeting, not at a cinema, showing monkeys that had been given meprobamate sitting peacefully in their cages, relaxed and alert, their eyes calm, their movements slow and deliberate. And then he showed the film to physicians. The physicians were interested, very interested. In 1955, Wallace Laboratories launched meprobamate under the brand name Miltown, named after the nearby borough of Miltown, New Jersey, where the laboratory was located. The drug was positioned as a minor tranquilizer, something gentler than the barbiturates, something you could take during the day and still function, something that would quiet the noise without turning off the lights, something that would do for a human being what it had done for those monkeys, let them sit still, let them breathe, let the restlessness dissolve into a warm, manageable calm. And here is where the laboratory and the kitchen finally meet. Here is where Frank Berger's accidental discovery in a wartime English laboratory reaches the woman at the Formica table, because the drug didn't travel from the laboratory to the kitchen in one step. It traveled through a chain of decisions, each one logical, each one well-intentioned, each one adding a link between a scientific finding and a cultural transformation that nobody intended and nobody could stop. The chain went like this. Berger and Ludwig made the compound. The executive approved it, reluctantly. The marketing team gave it a name, Miltown, friendly and familiar. The name of a place, not a chemical. The sales representatives visited doctors' offices. They left samples. They left brochures. They left, in some cases, the film of the tranquilized monkeys, which doctors watched on small projectors in their consultation rooms, leaning forward in their chairs, watching the animals sit calmly with their eyes open and thinking, I have patients who need this. And then the doctors began prescribing. The first prescriptions were cautious, small doses, short durations, for patients with genuine documented anxiety disorders, patients who couldn't sleep, patients who couldn't eat, patients whose hands shook and whose hearts raced, and whose minds would not stop circling the same fears, the same worries, the same questions, round and round and round in a pattern that exhaustion could not break. But the word spread. The word always spreads. A woman took Miltown and slept through the night for the first time in months, and she told her sister over the telephone the next morning, standing in her kitchen, twisting the cord around her finger, speaking in the low, conspiratorial tone of someone sharing a secret that isn't quite a secret, more like a discovery, a private revelation that feels too important to keep. Her sister listened. Her sister made an appointment with her own doctor the following week, and the sister told a friend. Over coffee at the kitchen table, in one of those conversations that starts with children and school and weather, and gradually, carefully, finds its way to the thing underneath. The friend leaned forward. The friend asked the name of the drug. The friend wrote it down on the back of a grocery receipt and put it in her handbag and carried it with her until she could mention it to her own doctor, who'd already heard about it from 3 other patients that week. The doctor wrote a prescription, and another, and another. And the prescriptions multiplied the way only a genuinely effective product can multiply, not through advertising alone, not through marketing alone, but through the simple, powerful, unstoppable mechanism of one person telling another person that something works. Through kitchen tables and telephone cords and whispered conversations at bridge clubs and parent-teacher meetings and the particular intimate network of women's communication that existed in those suburbs, a network that the men who designed the drugs and the men who marketed the drugs and the men who prescribed the drugs had never fully understood, but that moved information faster and more reliably than any advertising campaign ever could. You can imagine the moment. You can imagine being that woman, the one who takes the pill for the first time. You've been carrying the weight for months, the formless anxiety, the question in your chest, the restlessness that makes the mornings long and the afternoons longer, and the evenings a performance of contentment that exhausts you more than any physical labor ever did. You've been to the doctor. He's given you a prescription. You've picked it up from the pharmacy. You've brought it home. You've put it on the shelf above the sink next to the aspirin, in its brown glass bottle with its white label. And now, on a Tuesday morning, with the house empty and the coffee cooling and the refrigerator humming its eternal hum, you open the bottle and tip one pill into your palm. It's small, it's white, it's unremarkable, the kind of object that disappears the moment you stop looking at it. You put it on your tongue, you wash it down, and you wait. And the wait is the strangest part, because the pill doesn't hit you the way a drink hits you. Sudden, warm, obvious. It arrives quietly. It arrives the way sleep arrives, or the way a headache leaves, not with a moment you can point to, not with a before and after, but with a gradual realization that something has shifted. The tension in your shoulders, which you had stopped noticing because it had been there so long it had become part of you, eases. The knot between your ribs loosens. The thoughts that had been circling, the endless loop of laundry and dinner and children and lawn and husband and is this all? The thoughts don't stop exactly. They slow down. They lose their urgency. They become manageable. They become the kind of thoughts you can set aside, the way you set aside a book you'll finish later, without anxiety, without guilt, just later. And for the first time in months, the kitchen is just a kitchen. The silence is just silence. The morning is just a morning. And you sit at the Formica table with your hand flat on its cool surface and you think, this is what calm feels like. I had forgotten. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary commercial events in the history of American medicine. In its first full year on the market, Miltown accounted for nearly 70% of all new tranquilizer prescriptions in the country. 70%, up from less than 1% the year before. The growth was not gradual. It was not a slow climb. It was an explosion. A vertical line on every graph, a spike so dramatic that pharmaceutical historians still use it as the textbook example of a blockbuster drug launch. By 1957, more than 35 million prescriptions had been written. One magazine of the time calculated that this was equivalent to one prescription being filled every single second throughout the entire year. 1 per second. From January to December, every second. From the moment the clock struck midnight on New Year's Day to the moment it struck midnight on New Year's Eve, someone somewhere in America was filling a prescription for Miltown. Pharmacies ran out. Not occasionally, regularly. Some of them displayed handwritten signs in their windows. No more Miltown. More Miltown tomorrow. The demand was so enormous, so immediate, so overwhelming that the supply chain couldn't keep up. Pharmacists who had never seen anything like it, who had spent their careers filling prescriptions for antibiotics and painkillers and the occasional barbiturate, found themselves rationing a tranquilizer. They put limits on refills. They called distributors. They waited for shipments. And when the shipments arrived, the bottles were gone within hours, snapped up by patients who had been waiting, patients who had called ahead, patients who had asked their neighbours to check for them on their way to the shops. Celebrities took Miltown publicly. Comedians joked about it on television. The word itself entered the language. I need a Miltown became a phrase that people said casually, the way they might say, I need a drink, or I need a vacation. It became the first drug in American history that was not just prescribed but fashionable, the first pharmaceutical product that crossed the boundary between medicine and culture, between treatment and trend. Within 2 years of its launch, as many as 1 in 20 Americans had taken Miltown at least once. 1 in 20. In a population of roughly 170 million people, that's somewhere close to 9 million individuals who had placed a small white pill on their tongue and waited for the calm to arrive. Let that number settle. 9 million people. 9 million mornings in 9 million kitchens. 9 million hands reaching for 9 million bottles. 9 million pills placed on 9 million tongues. If you lined those people up, shoulder to shoulder, the line would stretch from New York to Los Angeles and back again. If you gathered them in a single room, you would need a room larger than any room that has ever existed. And every one of them, every single one, was looking for the same thing. Not happiness, exactly. Not pleasure, exactly. Just quiet. Just the sound of their own thoughts becoming manageable. Just the feeling of the world pulling back, just slightly, just enough to breathe. Hollywood took Miltown the way Hollywood takes everything, publicly, glamorously, with a wink. The comedian Milton Berle, whose first name made the joke irresistible, began calling himself Miltown Berle. He took the pill openly and joked about it on television, and the studio audience laughed, and the laughter was genuine because the joke was recognizable, because the audience understood, because many of them were taking the same pill or knew someone who was. The actress Tallulah Bankhead was photographed with Miltown in her handbag. Aldous Huxley, who had written Brave New World, a novel about a society that controlled its citizens through a drug called soma, a drug that delivered artificial contentment in place of real freedom, Huxley took Miltown. The irony was not lost on him. He wrote about it, but he kept taking it. The pill had crossed a line that nobody had drawn. It had moved from medicine into culture, from treatment into lifestyle, from something a doctor prescribed for a condition into something a person took, because the world was loud and the pill made it quiet, and the quiet was better than the noise. Nobody was treating a disease. Nobody was curing an illness. Millions of people were simply choosing every morning to lower the volume on their own lives, and the pharmaceutical industry was providing the dial. 35 million prescriptions in 2 years. Frank Berger had been looking for a way to preserve penicillin. Take a moment with that. Let the distance sink in. A man trying to keep penicillin from spoiling accidentally discovered a compound that made anxious monkeys lie still with their eyes open, and within a decade, 1 in every 20 Americans was swallowing the result. The distance between those 2 points, between a laboratory bench in wartime England and a kitchen table in suburban Long Island, is one of the strangest, most quietly devastating journeys in the history of modern medicine. And here is what that looked like in practice. Here is what it looked like in a kitchen on a street in Levittown on a morning in 1957 when the pill arrived. The bottle sits on the shelf above the kitchen sink between the aspirin and the children's cough syrup. It's a brown glass bottle with a white cap and a typed label. Your name, the dosage, the refill number. You've been refilling it for 8 months now. The pharmacist knows you by name. He knows your husband's name and your doctor's name and the name of the drug, and he fills the prescription without comment, without hesitation, without the kind of raised eyebrow that might suggest there is anything unusual about a woman in her 30s taking a tranquilizer every morning. Because there isn't anything unusual about it. Your neighbour takes the same pill. Her neighbour takes a different brand with the same active ingredient. The woman at the end of the street takes something stronger, prescribed by a different doctor for what her husband calls her nerves. The word nerves floats through the development like weather. She's got bad nerves. The doctor says it's her nerves. The pills are for her nerves. A word that sounds medical enough to be respectable and vague enough to mean anything. The pill doesn't make you happy. You're clear about that. It doesn't solve the problem, whatever the problem is. What it does is lower the volume. The restlessness is still there, somewhere underneath. But it's quieter now, more manageable, more like a hum than a shout. You can live with a hum. You've been living with the refrigerator's hum for years. One more steady, constant background noise in a house full of them. One more thing that's always there but that you've learned not to hear. Your husband doesn't know about the pills, or he does and doesn't mention them, or he knows and is relieved, because the pills make the evenings easier, the silences less charged, the question in your chest less likely to surface at dinner in a way that neither of you knows how to handle. The pills make you easier to be around. That's a terrible sentence, and it's true. The pills make you easier. Easier to live with, easier to manage, easier to ignore. And the system, the whole system from the pharmaceutical company to the doctor, to the magazine, to the house, to the marriage, the system runs more smoothly when you are easy. The pill had arrived. The question now was who it was being prescribed to, and why. Because the pill was not being distributed equally. It was not flowing out into the population in anything like an even pattern. It was going to one group, overwhelmingly, at a rate that was not accidental, not a quirk of the prescribing culture, not a statistical anomaly. It was deliberate. It was designed. It was, in the most literal sense, marketed. Women were prescribed Miltown and the minor tranquilizers that followed it at approximately twice the rate of men. Not slightly more. Not a marginal, arguable difference. Double. And the reason for this disparity was not hidden in footnotes or buried in archives or discovered decades later by historians with a political agenda. It was printed in full colour in professional medical journals, in advertisements that doctors read at their desks between patients, in their offices, in the same buildings where the waiting rooms were full of women who had come in with symptoms they couldn't quite describe. Those advertisements told doctors, in clear and persuasive language, that Miltown could help women manage the stress of domestic life. They told doctors that the drug could make pregnancy, a happier experience. One advertisement, printed in a medical journal and aimed entirely at physicians, suggested that the drug could help women cope with what it called the new industrial revolution, the revolution of household appliances. As though the problem facing American women was that their washing machines were too stressful. As though the anxiety they were describing in their doctors' offices was caused by the difficulty of operating a vacuum cleaner, and not by the fact that operating a vacuum cleaner was the most meaningful task their culture had left them. The medical establishment had a name for what these women were feeling. It appeared in the medical literature as a recognized diagnostic category, treated with the same clinical seriousness as any other condition. The name was not boredom. The name was not confinement. The name was not the entirely rational response of an educated, competent woman who'd been removed from meaningful work and placed in a house with no transportation and a lawn that needed mowing. The name was housewife syndrome, and the treatment was a small white pill twice daily. There is something in that detail that stays with me. The elegance of the system. The terrible, quiet efficiency of the whole arrangement. A woman feels a vague, persistent unhappiness, a weight in her chest, a restlessness that has no object, a question she can't quite ask. She goes to her doctor. The doctor, who's almost certainly a man, who has read advertisements in his medical journal telling him that this is a recognized condition with a pharmaceutical solution, nods sympathetically and writes a prescription. The woman takes the prescription to the pharmacy. She picks up the bottle. She takes it home. She sits at the Formica table, and she places the pill on her tongue, and she washes it down with coffee, and the question goes quiet. Not answered, not addressed, not even acknowledged as a real question, just quiet. And the system continues. The house stays clean. The lawn stays mowed. The husband comes home to a wife who is calm and pleasant and has dinner ready. The children are fed. The appliances hum. The economy, which depends on this woman buying floor polish and refrigerators and magazine subscriptions and increasingly small white pills, the economy continues, smooth and uninterrupted like a washing machine in the basement, turning and turning and turning. Let me take you inside that doctor's office for a moment, because the room itself tells you something about the transaction that's taking place. You're sitting in a waiting room. The chairs are wooden with thin cushions, arranged around the edges of a room that smells of antiseptic and old magazines. There are other women here. You don't know them, but you recognize them. The way they hold their handbags on their laps, the way they flip through magazines without reading them, the way they glance at the clock and then at the door. Waiting. You're all waiting. For what exactly is harder to say? For someone to explain why you feel the way you feel. For someone to tell you that the weight in your chest is not your fault, or that it is your fault, or that it has a name, or that it doesn't. You're not sure which answer you want. You just want someone to take it seriously. The doctor calls you in. He is kind. He is not dismissive. Exactly. He listens. He nods. He asks you how you've been sleeping, how your appetite is, whether you've been feeling what he calls anxious. And you try to explain. You try to describe the feeling, the restlessness, the flatness, the sense that something is missing that you can't identify. You try to put words around the question in your chest, but the words keep sliding away from it, the way language slides away from things that are too large or too close to have edges. You say you feel tired. You say you feel flat. You say you don't know what's wrong. And the doctor nods. He has seen this before. He's seen it many times, in fact, in this room, in this chair, from women who look exactly like you and describe exactly what you're describing, in almost exactly the same words. He has a name for it. He has a treatment for it. He reaches for his prescription pad, and the pen makes a quick, confident sound against the paper, the sound of a problem being solved, or at least being managed, or at least being moved from one column of a ledger to another. He tears the prescription off the pad and hands it to you. He tells you to take one pill in the morning and one in the evening. He tells you it will help you relax. He tells you it's very safe. He tells you millions of people are taking it. He tells you it's not addictive. You take the piece of paper, you fold it, you put it in your handbag, you drive to the pharmacy, or your husband drives you, because the car is his and the pharmacy is 2 miles away, and the sidewalks end at the edge of the development. You hand the prescription across the counter. The pharmacist fills it. He puts the pills in a brown glass bottle with a white label, and he hands it to you, and you hold it in your hand, and it's lighter than you expected, and the pills inside make a soft rattling sound when you move, like tiny seeds in a dry pod. You go home, you sit at the table, you open the bottle, you tip one pill into your palm, and this is the moment, this small, unremarkable, completely ordinary moment, where the entire system achieves its purpose. Not with force, not with cruelty, not with anything that looks, from the outside, like oppression. With a small white pill and a glass of water, and a kind doctor who genuinely believes he is helping, the pill dissolves. The question goes quiet. The refrigerator hums. The afternoon unfolds the way it always does. Laundry, dishes, dinner preparation, the children coming home, the husband's car in the driveway. And nothing has changed, and everything has been managed. I want to be honest about something. The women who took those pills were not fools. They were not naive. They were not passive recipients of a system they couldn't see. Many of them knew, in some wordless bodily way, that the pill was not an answer. They knew it the way you know that a painkiller is not a cure. It stops the hurting, but it doesn't fix the break. They took the pills because the alternative was to sit with the question, and the question was enormous, and the system around them offered no other way to carry it. The pill was not a choice made freely in a landscape of abundant options. It was the only door in a room with no windows. Nobody lied to her exactly. Nobody held her down. Nobody forced the pill into her mouth. But nobody asked her the only question that mattered either. Nobody sat across from her in that doctor's office and said, "What if the problem isn't you? What if the problem is the kitchen? What if the problem is the street with no sidewalks, and the car you can't drive, and the lawn covenant, and the marriage bar, and the magazines that told you this was supposed to be enough? What if the problem is that you welded bomber fuselages in 1943, and now you're vacuuming a carpet that will need vacuuming again tomorrow, and the world is telling you this is the same thing as happiness. Nobody asked. The pill was easier, the pill was cheaper, the pill kept the machine running, and now we come back to Betty Friedan. Because the rejected article, the findings from the 1957 Smith College survey that every women's magazine had refused to print didn't disappear. Friedan didn't accept the rejection and move on. She didn't file the questionnaires away in a drawer and move on to something more comfortable. She took the rejection and she sat with it, and something in her refused to let it go. She spent 5 years, from 1957 to 1962, expanding the article into a book, not a pamphlet, not a magazine feature, a book. She conducted hundreds more interviews. She travelled to suburbs across the country and sat in kitchens that looked exactly like the kitchens we've been walking through tonight, and she listened to women who sounded exactly like the women we've been listening to, and she wrote down what they said. She studied psychology, not just the academic kind, but the popular kind, the kind that showed up in advice columns and women's magazines and doctors' office pamphlets, the kind that told women their natural fulfillment lay in motherhood and homemaking, and that any dissatisfaction they felt was a failure of adjustment, not of circumstances. She studied sociology. She studied media. She studied advertising. She traced the entire cultural machine, thread by thread, from the wartime factory floor to the suburban kitchen, from the marriage bar to the Miltown advertisement, from the rising cleanliness standard to the silent question in the chest. And she found that the machine was deliberate. It was not an accident. The post-war return of women to the home was not a natural consequence of the men coming back. It was an engineered outcome, constructed by a culture that needed women to buy things, to consume, to create a domestic economy that would replace the wartime industrial economy. The housewife was not a role that women chose because they preferred it to the factory floor. The housewife was a role that the economy required. She was the engine of post-war consumption, the person who bought the appliances, the furniture, the cleaning products, the food, the magazines, the clothes, the toys, the houses themselves. Without her spending, without her commitment to the domestic sphere, the consumer economy would stall. And so the culture invested enormous energy in making sure she stayed where she was. Friedan laid all of this out. She named it. She called the book The Feminine Mystique, and she called the feeling, the vague, persistent, nameless dissatisfaction that 200 Smith College graduates had described in identical terms, the problem that has no name. And when the book was published, in February of 1963, it sold more than 1 million copies. 1 million copies! That number is worth pausing on. 1 million women and men, though the readership was overwhelmingly female, bought a book that told them the life they were living was not a personal failure but a cultural construction. 1 million women read the words "the problem that has no name" and felt, for the first time, the shock of recognition that somebody else had the same feeling, that the question in their chest was not theirs alone, that the restlessness was not a symptom of something wrong with them but something wrong with the world around them. Imagine what that felt like. Imagine sitting at the Formica table we've been sitting at all night, with the book open in front of you, and reading those words for the first time. The problem that has no name. 5 words. 5 quiet, precise words that unlocked a door that had been closed so long you'd forgotten it was there. And behind the door, not an answer, not a solution, not a plan, just the knowledge that the door existed, that the room you were in was not the only room, that the kitchen was not the whole world, even though the whole world had told you it was. Some women wept. Some women were angry. Some women called friends they hadn't spoken to in years and said, "Have you read it?" And the friend said yes. And there was a silence on the line that was not the old silence, not the silence of things unsaid, but a new silence, the silence of two people who have just discovered they've been carrying the same weight, and neither of them knew. The book did not change everything overnight. It did not open the factories or repeal the marriage bar or close the pharmaceutical plants. But it did something that no pill had ever done and no advertisement had ever undone. It gave the question a name. And a question with a name is a question that can be asked out loud. And a question asked out loud, in a room full of people who recognize it, is the beginning of a conversation. And a conversation is the beginning of change. And in that same year, 1963, a new drug was launched. Diazepam, Valium, stronger than Miltown, smoother, longer lasting, more effective at doing exactly what Miltown had done, which was to quiet the noise without turning off the lights. And it was marketed to women even more aggressively than Miltown had been, with advertisements that were more sophisticated, more targeted, more precisely engineered to reach the doctor at his desk and the woman in his waiting room. By the late 1960s, Valium had become the best-selling drug in the United States. Not the best-selling tranquilizer, not the best-selling pill in its category. The best-selling drug. Period. More Americans were taking Valium than any other medication on the market. At its peak in 1978, more than 2 billion with a B, Valium tablets were sold in a single year. 2 billion tablets. If you stack them on top of each other, the stack would reach the moon. If you laid them end to end, they would circle the earth several times. The scale of consumption was not just large, it was geological. It was the kind of number that stops being a number and starts being a landscape. In 1966, the Rolling Stones released a song called Mother's Little Helper, and the lyrics described exactly the scene we've been walking through tonight. A woman reaching for a pill to get through her day. The cooking, the cleaning, the children, the sameness. Mick Jagger sang it with a kind of sardonic detachment, a rock star's smirk at the desperation of suburban domesticity. But the women who heard the song, the women who were actually living the scene the song described, didn't hear sarcasm. They heard recognition. They heard someone finally saying out loud what the doctor's office and the magazine advertisements and the bridge club conversations had all refused to say, that the pills were not medicine. They were management. They were the system's way of keeping a woman functional without ever asking whether the function itself was the problem. The song was not a metaphor. It was, if anything, an understatement. And the Valium advertisements, the ones that appeared in medical journals aimed at physicians, designed to influence prescribing behavior, were even more revealing than the Miltown advertisements had been. One advertisement showed a woman staring out a window, her expression blank, her posture defeated. The headline read, "For the patient who can't quite cope." Another showed a harried-looking mother surrounded by demanding children. The copy suggested that Valium could help her manage the stress of modern motherhood. A third, and this is the one that stays with me, the one that feels like the entire story compressed into a single image, showed a woman standing in front of a blackboard covered in mathematical equations. She was wearing an apron. The implication was unmistakable. This woman was too educated for her role, too intelligent for her life, and the gap between what she was capable of and what she was permitted to do was producing a clinical anxiety that required pharmaceutical intervention. The advertisement did not suggest that the solution might be to let her use the blackboard. The solution was Valium. And then some of the women stopped, for different reasons, in different ways, at different speeds. Some because the prescription ran out and the new doctor wouldn't renew it. Some because they read Friedan's book, and something in it made them angry enough to flush the pills. Some because their bodies started to resist, started to need more, started to show signs that the quiet they'd been buying had a cost they hadn't been told about. I want to tell you about one of those women, and I want to be careful, because her story complicates the picture in a way that matters. Barbara Gordon was not a housewife. She was not trapped in a kitchen. She was not living in Levittown. She was an Emmy Award-winning documentary filmmaker who had worked on The Today Show and the PBS series The Great American Dream Machine. She was brilliant, successful, driven. She was exactly the kind of woman the feminine mystique was not supposed to touch. The woman who had a career, who had purpose, who had somewhere to go every morning that was not a kitchen. And this is the part that complicates the story, the part that makes it larger and more troubling than a simple narrative about bored housewives. Because the pills didn't stay in the kitchen, they didn't stay in the suburbs, they spread outward, upward, across every demographic, into the lives of women who had careers and women who didn't, women who were educated and women who weren't, women who were happy and women who were not. The pharmaceutical industry had created a product, and the product had found its market, and the market turned out to be much larger than the suburbs. The market was anyone who had ever felt that the world was too loud, too fast, too much, and who hasn't felt that. But in the early 1970s, a doctor prescribed her Valium, not for anxiety, not for the nameless question, for a back injury, physical pain, a straightforward medical problem with a straightforward pharmaceutical solution. And the drug worked, the way it always worked. It didn't just address the pain, it addressed everything. The edges of the world softened, the pressure eased, the noise, all of the noise, professional and personal, the noise of being a woman in a man's industry, the noise of ambition and competition and deadlines, the noise faded into something manageable, something warm, something that felt for the first time in a long time like peace. Barbara Gordon kept taking the pills. The back healed, the pills continued, the peace continued. And somewhere in the continuation, somewhere in the quiet routine of the bottle on the nightstand, the pill in the palm, the swallow of water, the gentle loosening of the world, a dependency built itself, brick by invisible brick in her nervous system. She didn't notice it happening. That's the thing about dependency. It builds in the spaces between awareness. The body adjusts. The tolerance rises. The dose that once produced calm now produces only normalcy, and the absence of the dose produces something worse than the original anxiety ever was, a creeping, climbing distress that feels like the world is coming apart at the edges. And so you take another pill, not to feel good, but to feel nothing, to return to the baseline, to get back to the place where the world is manageable and the noise is tolerable and the question, whatever the question is, stays in its place. Barbara Gordon took the pills for years. She was still working. She was still producing documentaries. She was still, by every external measure, functioning. But the functioning had a chemical flaw underneath it, and the flaw was getting higher. She needed more. The dosage climbed, the dependency deepened, and all of it happened under the supervision of physicians who believed, with complete professional confidence, that they were helping her. When she tried to stop, when her doctor advised her to quit cold turkey, which is the detail that still astonishes me, The detail that speaks volumes about how poorly the medical profession understood the drug it had been prescribing to millions of people for decades. Her body rebelled. The withdrawal was not mild. It was not uncomfortable. It was catastrophic. Imagine this. You've been taking a pill that tells your nervous system to be calm. You've been taking it for years. Your nervous system has adjusted to the presence of that pill the way your eyes adjust to a darkened room. Slowly, completely, until the adjustment becomes the norm and you can no longer remember what the room looked like before. And then, without warning, the lights come on. All at once. Full brightness. Your nervous system, which has been artificially dampened for years, rebounds. It overreacts. It fires signals that have been suppressed for so long that they come back distorted, amplified, wrong. You shake. Your muscles convulse. You see things that aren't there. The world becomes a place of terrifying, unbearable intensity because the chemical buffer between you and the world has been removed, and your body has forgotten how to process reality without it. Barbara Gordon suffered convulsions. She suffered hallucinations. She was hospitalized. More than once. The drug that had been marketed as safe, as gentle, as the reasonable solution to the ordinary stresses of modern life, had built a dependency so deep that removing it felt like removing a part of her nervous system. In 1979, Barbara Gordon wrote a memoir. She called it I'm Dancing as Fast as I Can. The book was a bestseller. It was adapted into a film in 1982 starring Jill Clayburgh, and it did something that no medical journal, no pharmaceutical advertisement, no doctor's reassurance had managed to do in 25 years of prescribing. It told the truth about what the pill actually was. Because here is the fact that had been suppressed, quietly, steadily, without any single dramatic moment of public reckoning. Miltown, the original wonder drug, the pill that had been prescribed at a rate of 1 per second, the pill that had been marketed as non-addictive, safe for daily use, suitable for pregnant women, Miltown in later controlled clinical trials, was found to be no more effective than a placebo. And its withdrawal symptoms, when they were finally studied properly, were found to be similar to those of narcotics. The most widely prescribed drug in America, for years, had been no more therapeutic than a sugar pill, and considerably more dangerous to stop taking. That detail is quietly devastating. Millions of women and men, though far fewer, had taken a pill every morning that did nothing a belief in the pill couldn't also do. The calm they felt was pharmacologically real. The chemistry was real. But the promise that the drug was specifically therapeutic, that it was treating a condition, that it was a medical intervention for a medical problem, that promise was not supported by the evidence. The system had given them a chemical and called it a cure, and the cure was, in the end, another form of the same silence. Don't ask. Don't name it. Don't change anything. Just take the pill and sit at the table and wait for the children to come home. Imagine being one of those women. Imagine sitting at the table you've been sitting at for years, with the bottle you've been opening for years, and learning, from a book, from a news report, from a conversation at the bridge table that for once goes deeper than bridge, that the pill you've been taking, the pill that your doctor told you was safe, the pill that made the question go quiet was no better than nothing. Imagine the feeling. Not anger exactly, not betrayal exactly. Something stranger. Something like the feeling of waking up in a room you thought was large and discovering that the walls are much closer than you believed. The quiet wasn't a cure, it was a blindfold. And now the blindfold is off, and the room is small, and the question is still there, and it's louder now than it has ever been. Some of them were angry, some of them were frightened, some of them were both, and the combination anger and fear together in a body that has been chemically quieted for years and is now unquiet for the first time, that combination was volcanic. It was transformative. It was the beginning of a conversation that the whole system had been designed to prevent. But some of them didn't wait. Some of them asked the question, and the asking, slow, painful, costly, courageous, changed everything that came after. Friedan's book became the intellectual foundation of second-wave feminism. The National Organization for Women Now was founded in 1966, directly in the wake of the conversation the feminine Mystique had started. The conversation that every magazine had refused to publish. The conversation that every pill had been manufactured to prevent. And the change, when it came, didn't come from above. It didn't come from legislation, at least not at first. It didn't come from a single moment of national awakening. It came from kitchen tables. It came from women sitting where they had always sat, at the centre of a house that faced inward, and deciding one by one in their own time, in their own words, that the quiet was no longer acceptable, that the question deserved an answer, that asking it out loud, even if the answer was terrifying, was better than swallowing another pill and watching the afternoon dissolve into the same warm, managed, chemical calm. Some of them went back to school, quietly, part-time, taking courses at the local community college while the children were in class, studying subjects they'd abandoned 15 years earlier, subjects that had been described as impractical for a woman who was expected to marry. Some of them went back to work, not to the factory floor, not to the rivet gun and the welding torch, but to offices and hospitals and schools, to jobs that were available and that paid less than they should have, and that were, for all their limitations, a place to go in the morning that was not a kitchen. Some of them started talking to each other. That was the truly revolutionary act. In living rooms and church basements and community centres, in the same kinds of spaces where they had organised bake sales and parent-teacher meetings, they began to have a different kind of conversation. They began to say the thing that every one of them had believed was unsayable: I am unhappy, and it is not because something is wrong with me. They began to discover what Betty Friedan had discovered in 1957, reading 200 questionnaires at her own kitchen table, that the feeling was not individual. It was not a personal failing. It was structural. It was built into the house and the street and the suburb and the economy and the medical practice that had given it a name and a prescription and called it solved. The asking was not easy. The women who asked were not celebrated, at least not immediately. Some of them were called ungrateful. Some of them were called selfish. Some of them were told by their own husbands and mothers and doctors that the problem really was them, that happiness was available, that the house and the children and the clean kitchen were supposed to be enough, and that the inability to be content with enough was itself a kind of sickness. Some of them were prescribed more pills. But the question, once asked, would not go back to sleep. That is the thing about certain kinds of questions. You can quiet them. You can medicate them. You can ignore them and suppress them and fill the silence with the hum of appliances and the rattle of pill bottles and the reassuring voices of magazine advertisements telling you that everything is fine. But once the question has been asked out loud, in the hearing of other people who've been carrying the same question in their own chests, once that happens, the quiet is over. The question is loose in the world, and it will find its way to every kitchen table, every doctor's office, every magazine editor's desk, every pharmaceutical advertisement, every corner of the system that was built to keep it silent. and the women who had sat at those kitchen tables, in those quiet houses, on those identical streets, with the humming refrigerators and the clean countertops and the small white pills beside their coffee cups, those women were not fragile. I want you to hear that clearly wherever you are tonight. They were not weak. They were not broken. They were not sick. They were competent, intelligent, resourceful people who had been placed inside a system that offered them no legitimate outlet for any of those qualities, and who had been handed a pharmaceutical when they noticed that something was wrong. The pill was not their failure. The pill was the system's answer to a question it did not want to hear. And the question that started in a kitchen at a Formica table on a Tuesday morning in 1957, the question that sounded like "is this all?" turned out to be one of the most important questions anyone asked in the 20th century. The Formica table is still there, in the kitchen. Not the same table, not the specific table that a specific woman sat at on a specific morning, but the idea of it, the shape of it, the coolness of it under your hands, the way it held the coffee cup and the pill bottle and the morning light and the question. It's still there because some questions don't go away when you answer them. They just become part of the furniture, and the refrigerator is still humming. That low, steady, constant sound that has been underneath this entire story from the very first moment to this one. You've been hearing it all along, haven't you? That hum, not ominous, not sad, just steady, just present. A machine doing what it was built to do, keeping things cold, keeping things preserved, making its small, constant noise in a room that is finally starting to get quiet. You've been lying in the dark for a while now. The story has been with you, and now it's settling. The way stories do when they've reached their natural end, not with a bang, not with a revelation, but with a quiet recognition. The facts are settling. The names are settling. Betty Friedan, and her questionnaire, and the women who answered it. Frank Berger, and his laboratory, and the monkeys that lay still with their eyes open. Barbara Gordon, and the pills she took, and the book she wrote when she stopped. They're all settling into the place where stories go when you let them go, somewhere warm, somewhere quiet, somewhere you can find them again if you need them, but not somewhere you need to carry tonight. What stays with you, if anything stays, is not the facts. It's the feeling, the recognition, that particular familiar weight of a question that deserves an answer, and that particular quiet courage it takes to ask it out loud in a world that would rather you didn't. You know that feeling. Everyone knows that feeling. The woman at the table knew it. And she asked anyway, eventually, in her own time, in her own words. Your body is warm now. The blanket is heavy in the right way, the way that tells your muscles they don't need to hold anymore, the way that tells your shoulders they can drop, the way that tells the tension in your jaw, the tension you didn't even know was there, that it can soften. Let it soften. The breath you're taking right now is slower than the breath you were taking at the beginning of this story. That's exactly right. That's how this works. The story carries you in, and the quiet carries you the rest of the way. The woman at the table, the woman we started with, the woman in 1957 with the coffee and the small white pill and the question in her chest, she's resting now too. Not because the question was answered, not because someone gave her a solution or a program or a plan, but because the day is over and the house is warm and the children are asleep in their rooms and the street outside is dark and the particular weight of a Tuesday in 1957 has finally, gently, let her go. Outside, beyond the kitchen window, the lawns are dark. The driveways are empty in a different way now. Not the emptiness of departure, but the emptiness of everyone being home, everyone inside, everyone settled. The street lamp at the corner is on, casting a warm cone of light on the sidewalk, and nothing moves through it. A dog barks far away. A car passes on the main road, the sound rising and falling and then gone. The houses are all quiet, and in one of those houses, in one of those kitchens, the refrigerator hums. That same low, steady note. Not a question anymore, not a symptom, just a sound. The sound a house makes when everyone inside it is safe. The sound of something running quietly in the background, the way certain things always run in the background, steady and constant and warm. The light from the street lamp makes a faint pattern on the kitchen ceiling. It shifts very slowly as the minutes pass. The kind of movement you can only see when everything else is perfectly still. The kind of stillness that comes after the questions have been asked, and the asking has been enough for now, and the morning is a long, gentle way away. Somewhere in the development, in a house you can't see from here, a light is on. A kitchen light, left on by accident or on purpose. The small warm glow of a bulb above a sink, casting a rectangle of yellow light onto the grass outside the window. Someone is awake, or someone forgot. It doesn't matter. The light is there, and it makes the darkness around it softer, the way a single lit window in a row of dark houses changes the entire street. Not by much, not dramatically, but enough. Enough to know that someone is there. Enough to know that the house is not empty. Enough to know that behind every dark window, someone is breathing. Someone is dreaming. Someone is resting in the particular, imperfect human way that people rest when the day has been long and the night has finally arrived. The woman at the table, our woman, the woman from 1957, is not there anymore. Not at the table, I mean. She went to bed hours ago. She checked the locks and turned off the lights and looked in on the children the way she does every night, standing in the doorway of their room and listening to the sound of their breathing, that quiet, steady, unconscious sound that is the most reassuring sound in the world, the sound that means everything is all right, at least right now, at least in this room, at least for tonight. And she stood there for a moment longer than necessary, because the sound was good, and the room was warm, and the children were safe, and for that one moment the question went quiet on its own, without any pill, without any effort, just the simple fact of standing in a doorway listening to children breathe. She went to bed. She pulled the blanket up. She lay in the dark beside her husband, who was already asleep, his breathing deep and regular, the breathing of a man who commutes to the city every day and comes home every night, and does not carry the same question in his chest, because the world has given him something to do with his days, and his competence, and his ambition. She lay there, and she let the day settle, the way sediment settles in still water, slowly, gently, until the water is clear again, and you can see the bottom. And she thought about tomorrow. Which would be Wednesday? Which would be the same? The table is cool, the house is warm, the hum is steady, and the rest is quiet now. Just the blanket and the breathing and the slow, even rhythm of a night that has finally, softly, settled into something that feels like rest.